today with part 4. And part 4 is all about seafood and how seafood impacts the restaurant industry. And you'll see from this roadmap, we're going to kind of go through pretty much what we've done in previous days, which is, we're going to take a look at the current situation, we're going to look at problems in sourcing, and then of course we're going to finish with how do we make a difference in food service and how you individually can become more educated to make good decisions. Now, today, we're going to kind of fly through these slides a little bit because there's a bunch, and we will, of course, send out the presentation. I really encourage you to go back and look at this again and spend a little time. There's a bunch of charts and graphs in this presentation today, but really take some time to go back and digest it, because the world of seafood is incredibly unique. It's very different than what we've talked about in previous days. Yesterday we talked about, animal husbandry, which really is a small number of animals when we think about it. But in the world of seafood, that's totally turned on its head, because think of how many types of fish there are in the oceans and the rivers and the lakes. And it's not just fish we're talking about. We're talking about the shellfish, mussels, oysters, snails, etc., clams. And we're even getting a little bit into algae, the seaweed of the ocean. There is so much for us to cover in this presentation, and the world of seafood is unique. One of the things that's truly unique about it, when we talked about animals yesterday, we're not talking about wild animals. We're not talking about wild cows running around. I mean, everything there is very much farmed. When it comes to seafood, a lot of the world's supply is still wild caught. And in other words, it is a completely wild endeavor. And then, of course, we have, farming, of fish, the aquaculture that is growing substantially that we're going to see. So we're going to talk about wild caught, and we're going to talk about what farmed fishing looks like. So what's happening? What is the current status of the world? And as we talked about on day 1, in all these presentations, we kind of start from the big global picture. So let's take a look and see where we are in the world today. So this is a lovely graph that demonstrates a little bit about where things are right now. And it takes a look at it over time from 1950 to 2016. And it just shows how much fish is actually being caught or produced. And you'll notice there's a very interesting sort of thing going on here, which we're going to dig into a little bit. And that is, if you notice that the orange part, what is the wild fisheries, is kind of stabilizing a little bit. If you notice around 1990, 1995, all of a sudden, what happens is that starts to flatline a little bit, and the aquaculture production increases dramatically. So that's really a very good representation of what's going on today. It's also very interesting to note that there is a growing demand for seafood. And the reason for that growing demand is that, number one, a lot of people in the health world are telling us to eat more of it. Secondly, there are just more people in the world, so there's a greater demand for fish and for seafood. But the other one, which is really interesting that a lot of people don't think about, is that if you go back 100 years, it was actually quite difficult if you lived inland from an ocean, let's say, to get ocean fish. Well, today everything has changed, and we can move stuff around much more easily. We can freeze stuff. We can harvest at sea and freeze, and it's become much easier to get seafood, even if you're not by an ocean. So let's take a look historically at that point that I was just talking about, which is, let's take a look in the year 1900. Let's go back a little over 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And you're going to notice that the red part of this is really like great fishing area. That was the best fishing. And, if you notice here, this is just the Northern Atlantic. We could do a similar thing with the rest of the world, but let's just, for sake of argument, look at that Northern Atlantic place. And especially if you notice by Northern US and Canada, Southern Canada, there's this thing called the Georges Banks there, which was one of the richest fishing areas in the entire world. So what happens? Well, what happens is between the 1950s and 1980s, ready for this? So in a 30-year period, what happens is that global seafood consumption increases 400%. 400%. And the reason for that, again, is that, there's more people, but most importantly, it was due to increases in technology and especially in transportation. And we move to 1999. So what happens 100 years later, all that red has disappeared. And in fact, that area, the Georges Banks, that once was one of the richest areas for fishing in the world. If you notice now, it went from a big bunch of red down to sort of into those blue areas, which is a dramatic change. And again, increase of fishery, and it sounds very much like what happened in many things. We just fished with abandon. We never thought we could fish the oceans out. And not only did technology increase in terms of transportation, and not only did the population increase, but also the fishing equipment increased in terms of its ability to harvest large amounts of fish and to do it very, very efficiently. Again, if you think about it, it's a little bit of that model of industrial fishing almost. And so what happened during this time is fishing was unmanaged. It was unregulated, and the industry grew just without any consideration of the natural limits. And during this time, what fishermen started to notice, for instance, like a swordfish that was, kind of routinely harvested at maybe 300 pounds, became a 200-pound swordfish, became a 100-pound swordfish, and we see that with many species of fish. So in just 100 years, what we did to the oceans. And we can look again at sort of global landings, how much fish was being brought in. Now, again, we're talking about wild fish here. And so you can see that about 1990, all of a sudden it starts to flatline. And in fact, in some instances, starts to go down. And what that means is that we have fully fished out or fully fished to the maximum the world's fisheries. Now that becomes a problem because at the same time, our population's increasing. And so somehow we have to produce more fish potentially for more people. And this becomes a real serious issue. And for us, by the way, let me just kind of put a parenthesis on this. For us chefs, we need to be aware that the wild fish that we cook are actually part of a dwindling resource and must be treated that way. These are precious resources, and we need to look at them much the same way like we look at a black truffle, and we treat it with amazing respect because it's so special. Well, these wild fish, they are special. A little bit later on in the presentation, we're going to talk about which species we should be using and which we shouldn't be using, but that's for a little bit later on. So let's take a look at where we're fishing and where our management efforts are ineffective. So take a look at this. Very interesting. We're looking at the global fishing fleet. And if you notice, the kind of interesting thing here is how few green spots there are in the world. In other words, we are doing damage to the oceans in those areas which are in red, which also represent large populations. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in this presentation is what's called illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU. And these are basically fishermen that are effectively fishing outside of the bounds of where they're supposed to fish. And essentially what happens then is they're stealing the fish from local populations, and they're doing so illegally. We've seen, for instance, along the West African coast, that fisheries have been overfished and have declined by 50% in the last 30 years. It's a real serious problem. Now we're going to move to this one, which is, we've seen this before, haven't we? We saw this on the first day I think we saw it on the second day. And now we're going to see it one more day. And this is a little bit about how everything is interconnected. And these are this whole topic of essentially we have nitrogen runoff from the fields, from fertilizers. And these fertilizers then go into rivers, and they go into bigger rivers, and then they, float downstream. And then when they're dumped into the ocean, what it does is it causes an algae bloom. And the algae bloom and the algae that then die effectively consume the oxygen in the water. And as a result, the fish don't have oxygen to survive. Now, some of the fish will swim to another part of the ocean potentially, but it's the creatures that are on the bottom of the ocean that also need to have oxygen that are unable to move, and they will die. And it basically creates like a desert underwater. It's a very serious issue, and you can see once again those areas in red and the areas in yellow. There's not a lot of green in there. And that is a real serious problem. Everything is combined or connected. And of course, those areas tend to grow every year, those red areas, because we're dumping more and more runoff into the ocean. And then we get into the topic of plastics. The amount of plastic that's dumped into the ocean is unbelievable. I mean, you can look later at this particular slide, and it talks about just one particular state in the US and how much plastics were just, taken from beaches, et cetera, and how much pollution. But if you think about it even more, there is something in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And this is an area where ocean currents effectively collect the plastics that are in the ocean that float there. And currently, are you ready for this? The size of this is 1.6 million square kilometers. 1.6 million square kilometers and growing. This is a massive problem. And it's because of our overdependence on plastics. It also, by the way, there's the whole issue of microplastics or microplastic particles that are in the sea that the fish then consume, and then which we get by way of the fish. And I saw in a UN report, the UN, this is 2017, basically, their idea was that there's something like 51 trillion microplastic particles in the sea. 51 trillion. That's an enormous, enormous number. Now, this goes back to us as chefs. And on the last day, we're going to talk about garbage waste and recycling and all of that. So, we really have to think about when we use plastics and how we use plastics, not only on an individual basis, but also just within food service. And other threats to seafood sustainability is pollution. We're going to talk about water, because remember, everything is interconnected. 2 days from now, we're going to talk all about water. And the amount of fresh water that exists on the planet is actually quite small. And the reality is that we tend to destroy these resources, these very, very precious resources. And we destroy them because of the contents that we, as a society, as humans, we put into the water, things like, chemicals, industrial waste, sewage, other, pollutants, pesticides, antibiotics, all of which can wind up in the fish that we consume and or kill fisheries. Mercury, for instance, or heavy chemical or heavy metals that wind up in fish that especially build up in larger fish, because the large fish eat the small fish, and it concentrates it. It's really an issue that needs to be looked at very, very seriously. By the way, also manure, which we talked about in the questions, that we talked about yesterday, also can be a contaminant, and manure can also contribute to algae blooms or the dead zones in the ocean. So it's, in terms of where we are in terms of the state of the waters for fishing, and what we're doing to it is rather dire, because remember, we still have this population that's growing, and at the same time we're kind of getting to what's called peak seafood, or maybe have gotten to peak seafood, how much the oceans, rivers, and lakes can actually produce. So now we're going to sort of jump into the sourcing issue and look at the fish that we're consuming. So the first thing is, we are overfishing, and this is a situation that is serious. Our fisheries today globally are in trouble. Today the global fishing fleet is at least 2 to 3 times as large as needed to sustainably catch sustainable current populations. 2 to 3 times, which means that if I'm a fisherman, I need to catch more and more fish, but frankly, there's less and less fish to be caught. As a result, fish populations are being grossly overfished. Even there are certain areas of the world where fisheries are very, very well monitored, but that's really in the minority, because again, it's very hard to police, the ocean. It's a very, very big place. So currently, at least 85% of the world's wild fish populations are being overfished or are over their sustainable limit, 85%. And if we don't do something to change that, we can actually fish them out and destroy them. It'll take a very long time for them to come back. In addition to that, there are other things like climate change. Now, the first day we talked about climate change, and we talked about the oceans warming up. We talked about acidification of the ocean. And when that happens, what happens is that things like coral, things like the calcium in the shells of oysters and clams begin to weaken, and it starts to damage those fisheries. Again, when we destroy the ecology of the oceans, what happens is that eventually that whole ecology starts to fall apart. And then we look at the issue of bycatch. Now, bycatch is what that basically refers to is that when you go out and you fish wild fisheries, you bring in a bunch of fish, but you don't always bring in the fish you want. And so you take what is the quote unquote bycatch, and it's not something you can sell or want to sell, and you throw it back into the ocean. Pretty much most often dead or damaged and will die. So translated, in addition to the fish that we're fishing, we're also fishing fish we don't want, and in doing so, even further damaging ecosystems. And it's really a domino effect. Things like sharks and rays and smaller fish or ugly fish that still can be delicious. These indiscriminate fishing methods can damage the ocean considerably. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about bycatch, but global statistics is somewhere around 25% of all wild caught is actually considered bycatch, 25%. And certain fisheries are far worse than others. So how do we get our fish? Well, there's a lot of different ways that fish is harvested. And again, there's so much information in this PowerPoint. I just hope that you take the time to go back and really look at this. And also do additional looking on the internet, because there's so much to learn. But basically, there's different ways of fishing, and each way of fishing has an impact on the oceans. And you can see there's different ones that are listed here. And what's interesting is that, they're not necessarily all good or all bad. It's really how they're being done. And quite, in many instances, there have been great improvements. For instance, when you're trawling and you're dragging this big net, that certain types of nets can be designed so that they don't destroy the habitat as much, or lets out certain species you don't want, or allows for birds not to be caught in the nets. Yet at the same time, it continues to be an issue. So you can see right here, this is trawling, and so what has happened in the past is that these would be dragged through the ocean, or many times along the bottom of the ocean, and in doing so, they would massively disrupt the ocean floor. And basically, it would be like just dragging a heavy metal object across the plants in front of your house or whatever, your lawn, it just all gets destroyed. And in doing so, we greatly damage the ecosystems. And some of these, just to give you an idea how big these nets are, some of these are so big that you could fit an entire 747 jet inside them. And they can be as long as 450 meters long. I mean, these things are massive, and again, can create great destruction to the ocean floor. Now, having said that, there are innovations that are happening. I don't want you to think that all fishermen are out there just destroying the habitats. That is not the case. There's many who are doing things like, for instance, they will not do ocean trawling in areas that are particularly fragile or where the seafloor can be damaged. There's some that don't quite go right on the bottom, or that have kind of rubber wheels that prevent it from destroying everything on the bottom of the ocean. Some even are putting cameras in there so they can kind of see what's going on and see what the impact is. So there are advances that are being made here. But as we're going to see in this next slide, we're back to this whole concept of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And this is really an issue because when we talk about fishermen who are really paying very close attention to the ocean stocks and treating the ocean from a sustainable standpoint, the people who are doing this tend not to be in that camp, and they're just out effectively being pirate fishermen, going out and stealing the fish from waters where they don't belong. And right now, the estimates are that anywhere between 20 to 50% of the catch of some wild fisheries are the result of pirated fishing. And what happens is these are large boats that go out and they collect the fish, they process the fish, they freeze the fish, and then they dump it in a port somewhere where they will be able to do so. Typically not an issue of fresh fishing. But again, these are vessels that can do massive destruction to marine habitats, kill marine animals, etc. So, it's an important thing, and it's something, by the way, how do you prevent this? And we're going to talk about your supplier, because you as a chef, as somebody in this industry, you're not in the seafood business. You're not talking to the person who is harvesting your fish. And part of this is to really deal with very reputable people and ask for proof. Where was this fish sourced from? Show me the traceability. How do I know that this is coming from regulated fishing, from people who are doing it correctly? And by the way, this is also an opportunity for you to inform your customers about the fact that when you buy fish, when you buy wild fish, you are buying it from people who are doing it very sustainably, and you have the proof to show them. So now let's jump into aquaculture. And there's not a whole lot of time to discuss this. I mean, I'd love to get into this in great detail, and I hope that you do. But basically, aquaculture is effectively farming fish. And the farming of fish is an important piece of the puzzle. When I hear people say things like, oh, we should just be, serving wild fish in our restaurants, or we should just be serving aquaculture fish in our restaurants, both of those are incorrect. It's really about getting into the nitty-gritty and the details of this, because there are amazing aquaculture operations around the world that are doing so in a very, very sustainable manner. And then there are others that are doing it in a less sustainable manner. And I will also just add this in, that I received a wonderful, where did it go in my computer now? A wonderful email from somebody on our call here. And I'm going to give it to you in a minute because I'm going to get the name wrong. But there are, I'll give it to you at the end of the presentation. There are basically organizations out there that are that are looking at and certifying aquaculture operations. And I'm embarrassed that I don't see it in my notes, but I'm going to give it to you in just a moment at the end of the presentation, because it's a really great website. And we're also going to send you to the website or give you the information as well as Frank's information to really, so how do you know if the aquaculture that you are, getting your fish from is actually doing it right or wrong? And sometimes we have to rely on the experts and organizations that are very reputable to do that work for us. Because remember, chefs were very, very busy. Now, back to aquaculture. So aquaculture is just like if we're gonna grow cattle or we're gonna grow chickens, it's an environment that we control. And aquaculture is basically that. It's growing fish or shellfish or seafood in ways that we control what happens. And the two main impacts in aquaculture are chemicals and feed. So chemicals can be things like antibiotics for fish that are maybe in stressed environments, overly stressed environments, which can be very negative. And then, of course, we have questions of feed. Now, questions of feed become well, there's a lot here. And so there are two types of fish. There are fish that are carnivorous, and there are fish that are not carnivorous. And essentially, there's a lot of looking at fish that are carnivorous. In other words, to produce the food that we have to feed them, many times what happens is that we will fish small fishing stocks around the world, or I should say, let me rephrase that, fishing stocks of little fish that we then use for the food for the larger fish in these operations. The issue there can be that, in effect, by feeding these carnivorous fish, the fish from other parts of the ocean, we're still damaging the ecosystems on the other side. So it is an important thing to understand the fish meal and the fish oil and where that comes from. From fish that are not carnivorous, that is a very interesting area that should be looked at, and those fish should be consumed more because they are, again, less impactful on the environment. We also can look at whether these operations are happening in open waters or whether they're happening on land. And again, one is not necessarily better than the other, it's how they're doing it. But there are operations that are in the ocean. You have a nice picture of one here, which is, all the fish swimming around in pens in open water. We also have some that are on closed systems on land. And that's another one that can be, it's very promising. At the same time, it also, can have its issues as well if it's done poorly. So what about us? Let's bring this back to food service for a moment. And this is really about which fish do we choose? Remember that unlike the animals we talked about yesterday, the ocean's a vast place and it's filled with many species of fish. What is interesting, though, is that we tend as a society, a global society, to cook a certain very small number of fish a lot in our restaurants. Things like tuna, salmon, shrimp. Those are consumed in vast quantities around the world. But which ones do we choose and how do we know? So here's just a number of bullet points. The first is work with a reputable fish purveyor and ask questions. Don't just assume that every fish you get from every purveyor has been grown properly if it's aquaculture, or wild caught properly with the proper fishing techniques in proper areas, that it's not illegal, etc. You have to work with a reputable fish purveyor, and that may cost you a little bit more, but it's worth it. And again, publicize it to your customers. So research the characteristics of sustainable fisheries. We're going to do that on the following slides. And we're going to go through that relatively quickly, but I would encourage you to go back and study those. Please think about de-emphasizing the seafood solution that we have. So in other words, I travel around the world quite a bit, and it's amazing. I see salmon, tuna, shrimp everywhere I go. That's great. They're wonderful fish. Now, at the same time, we can also talk a little bit about the feed conversion For instance, tuna requires about 8 pounds of fish meal to fatten 1 pound of tuna. So, we do get into that question of feed conversion like we talked about on Friday in our last class. But nonetheless, there's nothing inherently wrong about those species. But we have to also think about diversifying the seafood that we eat. And effectively what that does is it kind of creates a little bit better global balance in the fish that we're serving. Farm-raised carnivorous fish result in heavy harvesting of small fish, which affects ecosystems. Again, think about some of the non-carnivorous species that we can also consume. And as chefs, this is what we're good at. We're good at taking different species and turning it into something amazing. Think about seasonal seafood. Not all seafood is year-round, and seasonal also many times equates to local. And that reduces transportation costs. And frankly, in my opinion, it creates a menu that's far more interesting than, everywhere, when you go to a restaurant after restaurant after restaurant, and every restaurant has kind of the same fish on it, how immensely boring that is. We should instead be thinking about what are those other fish. And one of the things we'll see on a subsequent slide is this whole idea of trash fish. And trash fish was a term that was coined to basically talk about the bycatch fish. It's those fish that, they're kind of ugly maybe, or maybe they're a little bonier, or there's something in there, those fish that they weren't routinely consumed. Yet, in the hands of competent chefs, creative chefs, they can be amazingly delicious and offer points of differentiation. And of course, I'm going to finish with this bullet point on this slide, which is serve more vegetables and grains. Now, this is back to big picture. This is back to everything being interconnected, which is, yes, we have fish in the world, and yes, we have growing aquaculture, and all of that is great. But we absolutely have to be sure that we're also eating more vegetables. And if, go back to that Eat Lancet diet that we talked about on Friday, because that refers to not just animal proteins in terms of what we grow in farms, but it also pertains to fish proteins as well. So going back to vegetables and grains is another great strategy, because we have more people on the world and we have to still provide fish and seafood. Okay, so what are those characteristics of sustainable fisheries? And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because there's a lot here. Fishing impacts, and these, by the way, these are things to be asking your purveyors. This is kind of your checklist a little bit. What are the fishing impacts? I mean, what happens to the populations of those fish? Are they going up? Are they going down? Should we eat them? Shouldn't we eat them? What about bycatch? Is bycatch a part of these fish? How big is the bycatch? Are we getting our fish from people who are really trying to minimize bycatch? What is the overall management? Fishery regulations, are they following them? Are they fishing in the proper seasons? How do you know that these fish are not coming from illegal sources? These are questions to ask your purveyor. And of course, what does it do to the overall habitat? When it's done, are we destroying the habitat? Are we preserving it? Are we helping it to be sustainable? Your fish purveyors should be able to answer these questions. And if they're not, in my head, that says I need to find a new fish purveyor. Because, by the way, don't forget, power of the white jacket. Because if we go to our fish purveyors and they don't have these answers, and you threaten to go to a different fish purveyor, I guarantee you they're going to start finding answers really quickly. And what are the characteristics of sustainable aquaculture? And there's a whole bunch here. What about the data? I mean, they should have absolute data on their operations, very detailed data. What about the waste that's coming from aquaculture? How is that being dealt with? Is it damaging the environment, or is it being managed in a good way? What about habitat impacts? What is it doing to the rest of the habitat where it resides? And there's some horror stories in certain parts of the world about the way that certain shellfish are being farm raised. And in doing so, they're destroying the habitats that they're in. The chemicals that are used, what kind of chemicals / antibiotics are being given to the fish, and how is that being managed? What kind of feed is being given to the fish? What is the impact of the feed on the rest of the fisheries around the world? Escapes, are we keeping our farmed fish inside of the nets that they're in the ocean? That's really important, because we don't want to necessarily have crossing of genetic material. Disease, of course, and then where is the stock coming from? Where are we getting the initial fish? Are we starting from eggs and doing the whole thing, or are we going outside of the ecosystems? Now, I want to just jump into algae for a moment here, because algae is something that is really up and coming, and something we need to focus on. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. This could be a whole presentation in and of itself. But microalgae is really those little tiny single-celled plants, which are now being harnessed to do all kinds of very interesting things. And we're learning about their overall potential for health. And then, of course, we have macroalgae, which is basically what is seaweed. And seaweed is in my opinion, it's something that has tremendous promise for the world. They're very nutritious. They grow easily. You don't have to fertilize them. I mean, the ocean takes care of that all on its own. And the potential is amazing. And we are just scratching the surface for what kinds of seaweed and how many that are out there. And again, for chefs, this is right up our alley. This is how we get creative, and we create algae or put algae in our dishes that's delicious. Other chef trends, just really quickly, trash fish I talked about. Taking those fish that are unusual, different, weird, ugly, and many times delicious, and turning them into something incredible. Reducing the overall size of the portion of seafood. Now, this goes back to what we talked about with animals as well in the whole Eat Lancet report, which is, let's serve the shellfish or the fish, but let's make the portion size smaller and really much more in favor of the vegetables on the plate. And I'm going to finish with this particular slide. And I will say that, there are many organizations around the world that do this work for us. These are the ones who are out there who are basically doing the science behind it, and doing the science behind all the fishery stocks in the world, and giving us basically telling us what it is that we need to be doing so that we're harvesting the right fish, serving the right fish in the world. And one of them that I particularly recommend is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch. And this is so great, because what the Seafood Watch effectively does, we're busy chefs, and we don't have a lot of time to be running around, researching who's doing what and how many fish and what's the global stocks. And these are the people who do it for us. And they then publish the data in a way that's very simple to understand for us. So there's no reason in the world that we chefs should not be using these resources in our personal lives to be better educated, but also then to make purchasing decisions for the restaurants and the hotels, the food service environments that we work in. These people, Monterey Bay, and there's others out there as well. Just be sure that they're absolutely scientifically based, and just like everything on the internet, be sure that they're real. By the way, I just found the website that I was talking about earlier, and it's called Best Aquaculture Practices. And that is a certification that looks at aquaculture practices. And again, we're going to send you the websites for the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch and for the best aquaculture practices as well. But again, there's many others out there. So with that, I think we have gone through seafood. There's so much for us to talk about with this. But like everything, it's about education, and it's about your personal education, but it's also about educating your customer as well, and letting them know that the fish that you're serving, the portion size that you're serving, is all about sustainability. It's all about making sure that the oceans remain a safe, not a safe, but a sustainable resource for the future generations, so that there's fish and in enough quantity around the world, and that the people who are doing aquaculture are doing it in the right way. And that's important, because when we tell our customers that we care about that, basically it's a way to say that we care about humanity. And it's also a reason that they should come to our restaurant. So with that, I want to thank you once again for being with me. These are just incredibly wonderful times. So I want to say a huge thank you.